Welcome to the Mutant Algorithm, the real story. When lockdown was announced, Gavin Williamson decided against exams. Clearly, it would be almost impossible to safely distance during exams, as it is impossible to set up an exam hall with desks at precise 1 metre intervals apart, and it is impossible to stagger the entry of students to keep them at least a metre apart, because teachers simply can't be trained to use a tape measure. It is simply beyond them. No, that wasn't the real reason. Governments don't need exams to measure what students actually do and don't know. This is why Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, wrote to Ofqual on the first day of lockdown, telling them that they should ensure, as far as is possible, that qualification standards are maintained and the distribution of grades follows a similar profile to that in previous years. Governments need exam results to remain nearly the same every year, so that A, they improve slightly, which means that the government is clearly improving education, and B, they don't improve too much, otherwise voters would suspect that the exam results are possibly a fiction. If exams measured what students know, this decision would make no sense. Like most of our European partners, we would have kept some form of exams during lockdown. Some students, true, would have learned more during lockdown, and some would learn less. Exam results would reflect this, and universities would alter their admission grades. But this only makes sense if you care what students know. And that is not what exam grades are intended for anymore. Here are the numbers. Over 50% of 17 to 30-year-olds have been to university, and over 70% of students get to study A-levels, so at a national level the actual grades students receive are largely irrelevant. Anyone who wants to be educated is educated. Governments like grades because they use them not to measure pupils, but to measure and label schools. This helps them to get elected while saving money. Lots and lots of money. The school label is important as a way of sorting schools into 5 groups. These are called well above average, WA, above average, average, below average, bar, and well below average, WBA. When Gavin received warnings from Ofqual that the algorithm would only predict 40% of individual students' grades correctly, this didn't make him change his mind. Why? Because over the whole country the grades for each school would remain similar to last year. Most importantly, the WAs and the Rs would still see students getting great results. So the parents voting from these schools would still be much more likely to vote for the government. WAs and Rs normally attract parents who are passionate about their children's education, which makes it much easier to become and remain a WA or R. Parents often pay thousands of pounds each year for the privilege and move house to be near such schools. This means that their children get better grades, which means more parents move house, so house prices go up. Well-off parents are therefore actually paid to send their children to go to a better school, which is an incentive few of us can resist. The easiest ways to become a WA is to be in London or somewhere wealthy, where parents can afford to move to a more expensive house. 18 of the top 20 educational boroughs in the country are in fact in London. Other ways include having high levels of immigrant families, be a religious school, have a very strict behaviour policy, admit very few students with low prior attainment, employ more young cheap teachers who aren't yet very skilled at teaching. A school with average teaching will easily become a R or a WA if the above circumstances are met. Parents from such schools are much more likely to vote, and because school league tables benefit them both educationally and financially, they are much more likely to vote for the government. Even with the 2019 landslide victory, this government received only 43.6% of votes, but as only 67.3% of voters actually voted, the government only needed to persuade 29.3% of voters to vote for them. That most of those will be parents of children who went to WA and R schools. Those who support league tables of schools argue it seems like a good idea for raising standards, but because 50% of schools have to fail in a league table regardless of standards, this can never happen. And because telling people they are failures has never been a successful way to make them into a success, the league tables can only ever make overall standards worse. But standards are irrelevant to league tables because each year Ofqual has to make sure that the same percentage get top grades, whatever students actually score in their exams. Enter the mutant algorithm, which operates each and every year. If every student in the country suddenly developed amnesia in the last half of each of their exams, there would be no decrease in top grades, and there would be no increase in bottom grades. Why? Because our exam results are always calculated by the mutant algorithm, which makes sure this year's results always look very much like last year's results. To see how crazy this is, you only need to think about obesity. If we made sure that obesity levels were based on previous year's measurements rather than what people actually weigh, we would claim that we still had 1993 levels of obesity, 53% since you ask, compared to 2020 levels of obesity, which are 64%. This would be a very useful fiction if governments could use it to fund hospitals based on complications expected from 53% of the population rather than 64% as they do with schools. They would save a lot of money. Unfortunately, the actual consequences of obesity are very easy to measure in raised admissions of types 1 and 2 diabetes, heart attack, stroke, and increased risk of death by pandemic. Not funding their treatment would quickly persuade patients to vote for a different government. But this doesn't apply to schools. We don't have any other measures to say whether our exam results are a fiction, which is perfect for governments because the real purpose of league tables is to buy the votes of educated parents and make sure that the education budget doesn't keep growing. To slash the budget without appearing to damage education, you must do 3 things. Number 1, maintain the fiction that standards are getting slightly better. This is why Gavin wrote to Ofqual to demand exam results didn't change. Number 2, make sure the bottom 50% of schools have much less funding. This saves a lot of money. Number 3, set up a special fund, the Pupil Premium Fund, which makes it look like the government cares about removing disadvantage and inequality. Let me show you in simple numbers. An inner London school will receive £6,548 for each student. A school in the southwest will receive £4,608. Even if every single student qualified for the Pupil Premium Fund of £955, every pupil would still be £725 worse off by not living in central London. With an average school having 1,000 students, a school outside of London will receive £1,720,000 less than the school in inner London every single year. In other words, to make sure all students receive the same quality of education as those in London, the government would have to increase spending in over 3,000 secondary schools by about £1.5 million each, which totals around £4.5 billion. The league tabling of schools is therefore a way to save £4.5 billion every year, and the government receives no blame for this because voters can see that 50% of schools are doing well. And from this 50%, the government only needs 29% of voters to vote for them. The main job of the mutant algorithm was to maintain this fiction that schools are getting slightly better and ensure the WA and R schools remain successful. This stops voters blaming the government, instead helps them blame non-WA and R schools, their incompetent head teachers, their work-shy teachers, who are in any case always on holiday and can't even operate Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Hangouts, or wearing a COVID mask. Now, imagine that the government did invest an extra £4.5 billion. What good would that do them? None. Voters would have to pay more in taxes, and fewer of them would vote for the government. There would be no increase in WA or R schools, so no increase in potential voters by improving education for all. Yes, children everywhere would benefit and know more and get higher paid jobs, secure better futures and arguably live more fulfilled lives, but this is no good to a government if they can't get re-elected. So the mutant algorithm isn't new. It's what our education system has done since 1992, when it was decided that 50% of schools had to fail. It's taken you rather a long time to notice.